you're new to Vancouver or you're thinking of moving to Vancouver and you have children, well, this video is for you, because this video is all about the schools in Vancouver and the surrounding suburbs. And most specifically, it's about the best schools in Vancouver and what are those schools and how do you find them and how do you get your kids into them. Those are the questions that I'm trying to answer in this video, so stay tuned to the very end, because not only am I going to tell you about the best schools, but I'm going to tell you some really important tips when it comes to buying real estate around some of the best schools in the city. So in British Columbia, there's approximately 650,000 students in elementary school and secondary school. Roughly 565,000 of those go to public school. So approximately 87% of kids go to public school. Roughly 13% or 85,000 kids go to private school. And so, as you probably guessed, Vancouver reflects that. We have a public school system, we have private schools, and we also have independent schools that are typically religiously affiliated. So we have those three options when it comes to students attending school in Vancouver. What I first want to do is sort of run through those three options and what are the pros and the cons of each of them. So first of all, the public school system. Number one pro, it's got to be that it's free. I mean, you're paying for it already in your taxes, and so you're not paying any additional money for school. Number two, in Vancouver, is that the schools are in your community. They're close by. It's one of the incredible things about living in the city of Vancouver. No school is more than 1.6 kilometers away. So it's very easy for kids to walk to school. Now, it is going to be different if you live in some of the suburbs that have been developed in more recent years as we've been more dependent on vehicles. And in those suburbs, yes, there are typically larger schools that have larger catchments where people typically will have to drive or bus in. But in the city of Vancouver, being a much older city, developed before common use of vehicle, we have schools that are scattered throughout the city to be convenient to walk to. Another pro, and granted this can be a pro or a con, it kind of depends on your perspective, but our public schools are not segregated based on sex, so they are all co-ed. Our public school system is incredibly good quality. I'm not going to say that it's in the best in the world, but it's certainly in the top 5. So Vancouver has a very strong public school system, but you do want to keep in mind that the schools that have the best reputation tend to be in the most affluent area. I'm going to try and explain that to you a little bit further on in the video. And then finally, one of the other big pros is that the schools do offer a lot of specialized programs. You know, the school in your catchment may not offer it, but you can often go to a different school that offers programs that you or your son or daughter might be interested in participating in. So in particular, the IB program, the advanced placement program, mini schools are a big one. And what those are, if you're not familiar, they tend to be for more advanced learning. They're small buildings, usually separate buildings, separate structures on the school campus, where a smaller number of students will attend, and they'll remain in a student cohort together typically, but be much more focused in their studies. And then there's also French and Mandarin immersion programs. French is much more common. There's just a couple schools, I believe, in the city of Vancouver that offer Mandarin immersion, but it does exist. And when it comes to immersion, you can either start at kindergarten or you can start late immersion in grade 6. And then finally, there's also outdoor education programs. And while I was not accepted in the International Baccalaureate program or a mini school, I was lucky enough to get into an outdoors education program in my high school, Prince of Wales. It's called Clatwood Trek. And honestly, it was one of the greatest parts of my secondary education. It taught me so much about being independent, gave me so much incredible confidence, and also introduced me to the outdoors and gave me skills that I still use today and that I'm teaching my own children now, even as we speak. I'm planning on going camping with them in the next couple of weeks. But, you know, many of these programs have incredible value, and as you might be able to tell, I myself went through the public school system. You know, I personally believe that the public school system is incredibly strong here locally. All right, but public schools, they can't all be pros, right? There's definitely some cons. Now, I would say as a parent, sending my children to public schools currently, one of the big drawbacks, one of the big cons, is that you don't really have the same kind of input in their education as you would if you're a paying customer of a private school. One of the things that you're paying for when you send your child to a private school is that you have the ear of the principal and of the teacher, and they're going to be listening much more attentively when it comes to things that you would like changed or handled in terms of the education of your child. Another big con, I think, that people are only realizing in recent years is that just because you're in the school catchment doesn't mean that you're actually going to get your kid into that school. In the city of Vancouver in particular, there's some schools that are more oversubscribed than others, in particular where there's just been a lot of development, and the schools just haven't kept pace with the number of people that are moving into the area. So many of those higher density parts of the city are facing a challenge primarily with the elementary schools. And so you might find, you are in the catchment for an elementary school that you want your child to attend. You actually have to apply. And if there's not space, then they won't be able to accept your child. They will prioritize kids that are in catchment and already have siblings in the school. But if there's just simply not room, then they'll place you at a nearby school. So it's an imperfect system, unfortunately. My understanding is that the city and the provincial government are trying to play some degree of catch-up in providing more space in the schools that are in those higher density residential areas. And then third con, I have to admit this is a pretty subjective one, but people would argue that the quality of the education isn't as high as it is in private schools. I'm not so sure of that. I think there's a lot of value in going to public school in Vancouver. The quality, as mentioned, is incredibly high and ranks very, very high. But by some measures, it is shown that they do not perform as well as private schools. The reason that we have a pretty high quality of education is that, unlike some parts of North America, our school system is not community funded. It is funded by the provincial government. So the provincial government gathers the taxes and then distributes the money for the education throughout the province evenly. So all the schools, based on the number of students that attend, get equal funding. And then there's also sort of standardized expectations from the provincial government about the quality and the level of education that's being provided. So my understanding in other parts of North America, in particular in other parts of the United States, that there can be vast differences between different schools in the same city. That's not really the case in Vancouver and in the Lower Mainland. The quality of education in the public school system is very even. I would be remiss in not mentioning, though, that there is a benefit to attending schools that are in more affluent areas. And stereotypically, sort of what's considered to be a better school in the public school system tends to be the schools that are in more affluent areas. And it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that many buyers who are more affluent want to move to those areas because they feel that the schools are better. But the main reason that those schools do tend to have a bit of an advantage is that a lot of extra funding comes through the Parent Advisory Council, so the PAC, and a lot of fundraising takes place throughout the year, and extra programs and extra equipment, technology, computers, iPads, that type of thing. Those are purchased with the money that is raised by the PAC through the year. So you can find an imbalance beyond the funding that happens from the government level, sort of in the equipment that is provided from, perhaps a lower income inner city school to a higher income affluent area school. All right, so private schools. These are the schools that most people who are looking to come to Vancouver have heard about. So there's schools like St. George's, private boys' school, York House, and Crofton House, both private girls' schools, St. John's School, and Stratford Hall. Both of those are newer entrants to the private school system in Vancouver, but both considered incredibly strong schools. In terms of pros for private schools, obviously, what they're selling is that they have a higher level, higher quality of education. And by some standardized testing, that would prove to be true. As an example, percentage-wise, the number of people that are graduating from those schools, almost 100%. So by many measures, private schools are providing a very high level of education in Vancouver and are of excellent quality. A second pro, I would say, is that they really provide an amazing networking opportunity. Obviously, they're expensive, so families that are sending their kids there tend to be more affluent. There's sort of an easier entry to higher paying jobs. Having the networks to get into those types of positions is more common. But it's not only a network for students, it's also actually a pretty strong network for the parents. And there's a lot of events, a lot of time that's spent bringing those parents and those families together in a way that's not really happening, sort of facilitated through the public school system. So that, I believe, is an enormous advantage of the private school system. And third would be extracurricular activities. Because they're paying money to be going there, the schools are providing sort of a higher quality, a higher level of extracurricular activities, whether that's school trips or sporting events, school teams, or just clubs, things to do after school, summer programs. I went by a couple schools this afternoon, and there were kids at those private schools, going to basketball practice or summer camp. And so there's sort of this year-round mentality that if you're attending a public school, you don't have that option. You're sort of left to your own devices on what your kids are doing through the summer months. And so the cons of private schools, well, there's a few of them, and for me, they're pretty big. The biggest one is the cost. I mean, they can be incredibly expensive, in the range of $30,000 to $40,000 for non-boarding. Considerably higher if the children are able to board with the school. But with one child, that's an enormous amount of money. But if you have 2, 3, 4 children, in my own case, I have 4 kids, I couldn't possibly imagine spending $160,000 a year sending my 4 children to private school. So yes, a big con for many people. The bar is set very high economically. Number 2 would be that it's very, very hard to get in. There's not a lot of spots. There are a lot of people with the wealth to be able to send their kids there, or who sacrifice to be able to send their kids there and see value in sending their children to private school. But it's incredibly, incredibly challenging to get in. I believe one statistic that I saw for Crofton House in particular, a very well-known, very well-reputed girls' school, only 17% of applicants actually get in. I mean, it's harder, I don't know this for a fact, but it would seem it might be harder to get into Harvard than it would to get into Crofton House. In terms of applying, but it's not necessarily the aptitude or the intelligence of the child that's being tested. It's sort of like, will they fit in? Are they a child that we can teach and see grow within this community? But I think another big hurdle that needs to be reached is that what they're looking for is families that are going to be good members of the community. And are they going to ruffle feathers? Are they, going to contribute to the community? That type of thing. So they're looking for not just the best and brightest, but also the best fit in terms of the children and the families. And then third con is that very frequently these private schools are segregated by sex. And I have to admit, that's not necessarily a con. But when I was a kid, I don't know how serious this was, but I remember my parents asking me if I wanted to go to a private school. And, we didn't really have the money to be doing it, but they would have sacrificed in order to send their child to what they would have seen as the best possible school. And my answer was absolutely not. I was in grade 9 maybe at the time. I wanted to be around girls. I didn't want to go to a private school where there'd only be boys. And so St. George's would be a private school that is exclusively boys. Crofton House and York House would be girls-only schools. But of course, these days, what wasn't available when I was a kid were other private schools like Stratford Hall and St. John's School, which are co-ed. All right, so and then the last category are those independent schools, and which are most commonly religiously affiliated, specifically Catholic. And those are schools like Little Flower Academy for girls, Vancouver College for boys, Immaculate Conception, and Corpus Christi. There's a number of others, but those are sort of the most well-known. In terms of pros, once again, these pros and cons can be very similar to the private schools. We have high-quality education. We have a really strong network, both for students as well as parents, and those extracurricular activities. So they have incredibly strong sports programs. lots of great coaching. In terms of cons, they cost money. In this case, they're considerably less than the purely private schools, so they get a little more funding from the province. They are generally in the $10,000 range, so maybe as low as $6,000 and as high as $10,000, but in that kind of range per year. They're also incredibly challenging to get in. So, there is an application process. They are, just like the private schools, looking for good students that are teachable and that can fit in, but then also families and parents that are going to be able to fit into the community. The other one that's in common with the private schools is they're also segregated by sex. That is subjective, but predominantly they're going to be either boys or girls schools. And then the last one is that they are religiously affiliated, and that is once again subjective. I mean, if you are Catholic and or Christian faith, then it might be very important for you to send your children to a Catholic faith. But for those people that aren't, that may be an incredible deterrent. So something, to be up to you, what is important to you, and if that religious upbringing is important, then these Catholic independent schools are going to be a really good fit. And this would not be a con. Real quick, if you're getting any kind of value out of this video at all, hit that like button so more people just like you get to see this video too. And if you want to see more of me, I do put out videos about living in Vancouver, about moving to Vancouver every single week. Hit the subscribe button if you want to see more of me. And I'd like to get a conversation going. I'd love to hear what schools you're looking at sending your children to, which schools you went to, or what schools you're hoping to send your children to. Comment down below when you get a chance. Now let's get back to the video. Okay, so let's talk about the structure of the school system. It's important to know that there are 11 different school districts in the Vancouver area, and they're all slightly different. So if you are moving here from somewhere else, depending on where you're moving, you do want to look into the school district and what are the rules, how does the application process work for that particular school district. But what I can say is that in the Lower Mainland, we typically have kindergarten to grade 7 as being elementary school. Schooling starts in grade 5, sort of the free schooling system, but it's not a requirement to start in grade 5 as a 5-year-old. It is a requirement to start going to school in grade 1 as a 6-year-old. If you're in Vancouver, incidentally, that I would say would be a mistake, because you're going to have a really hard time if you're not already in the school in kindergarten to get your kid into the school in grade 1. So you definitely want to make a point of trying to get your kids into school in kindergarten. And then secondary school goes from grade 8 to grade 12. So typically that's from the age of 5 until 18 is what our school system covers. There are some areas that have a third level of schooling, and that's middle school. It's because of various school districts, they don't all run exactly the same. So they are areas such as Coquitlam, Port Moody, and New Westminster have middle schools. And the middle school years are grades 6 to 8. So you would have an elementary school that goes from grade 1 to 5, middle school from 6 to 8, and then high school goes from grade 9 to 12. School is usually from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., Monday to Friday. There are some variations. I know some elementary schools might start at 8:30, run to 3:30. High school might go from 9 a.m. to 2:30. So there's sort of variations exactly, but roughly it's 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And then the other important thing to know about how that all works is that the school year tends to run from the first week of September to the end of June. And it always is after Labor Day. So after the Labor Day long weekend, wherever that happens to fall, that's where school begins. And it runs right through the year until the end of June. There are a number of statutory holidays through the year. And there's also professional development days. So the teachers are doing their own professional development, and so the schools close down on those days. Frankly, that as a child was amazing, because it meant, there were long weekends, not infrequently. As an adult with 4 children, it feels often a little bit painful when there's yet another day where you have to figure out, I'm working, my wife is working, and we got 4 kids at home because it's a Pro D day. So it makes it a little bit of a scramble, unfortunately, but that is part of the system, something to be aware of. And speaking of something to be aware of, I am a real estate agent that has helped hundreds of families move to Vancouver over my 15-year career. If you're thinking of moving to Vancouver, I'd love to help you as well. Just click, no, don't click, just use that contact information there right on the screen. If you want to click, it's going to be in the description of the video, a Calendly link to set up a conversation between us. Reach out anytime we can get that conversation going. Now let's get back to the video. All right, so how do you apply specifically to the public schools? If you're thinking of a private school, that application process is going to be different for every single school. So you're going to want to do a little bit of research about, what school, what budget you have, and then go to their websites and make those applications through their websites. If you are thinking of the public school system, kids are eligible to enter at 5 years of age, as I mentioned. An important note is in Vancouver, the application process begins November 1st. I think it's November 1st to January 1st. You have priority for the school. If you only apply after January 1st, you are not in that first tier of applicants and you may not get a spot. So very important, make your application at some point between November 1st and January 1st if your child is entering kindergarten. But again, it's not mandatory for children to attend kindergarten. It is mandatory once they're 6 to starting grade 1. If the child wasn't born in Canada or they're enrolling in grades 1 to 12 and they don't speak English at home, then they're required to do a different registration process, and that's through the Newcomer Welcome Center, not their local school. So if they're not a newcomer, then they do register through their local school in the catchment in which you live. And there is a tool, I'll link that in the description below, for a school locator. And whatever school district you happen to be in, they will all have their own school locators. So you just plunk in your address and it outputs what your school is, and that's the school that you reach out to make the application. There are some requirements as part of that application process. One is proof of age, whether it's a birth certificate or a passport. 2 is proof of resident status. So if it's not a passport, as an example, then you need a permanent resident card. And proof of home address. So that could be a bill, a lease, or a driver's license. And also an immunization record. And it is a requirement in BC that children get immunized against disease. And so you need that immunization passport when you make the application for your child at their local school. So now what about the best schools? How do we find them? There is the Fraser Institute rankings, and those are sort of the gold standard for judging a school's value. There's a lot of argument against how valuable the Fraser Institute's rankings are. I think one of the arguments against it is that many of the schools that are top ranking in that system are gaming the system. So they are basically programming their schools to produce good test results so that their rankings in the Fraser Institute will elevate. That's not something that public schools tend to do, and so the weighting of the private schools versus public schools is very obvious. The private schools are ranked far higher than any of the public schools are in the Fraser Institute rankings. I would consult the Fraser Institute rankings. I would take them with a grain of salt, and I would remember that the difference in public schools in the Lower Mainland, because of the way that they're funded, isn't really that great. They are all very good schools, and your child will have a very good education no matter what school they go to. Overall, I think it is really important to remember that the quality of schooling in the province is incredibly high. The quality of schooling in the city is incredibly high. And again, that is because of the provincial funding system and that the province sets the standards and the curriculum. So that is sort of an even playing field. What is not even is that there are differences because of the added funding that comes from the parents. And the more affluent areas do get more funding, more fundraising funds come from the parents in areas like Dunbar, Kerrisdale, Point Grey than they would in a neighborhood such as the downtown east side, as an example. I mean, that's pretty obvious. But, whether your child goes to a school off Main Street or Arbutus or Commercial Drive, those schools are all going to be pretty darn good. The schools that, we point to typically as the best schools are usually the most expensive private schools. So St. George's, Crofton House, York House, some of the religious affiliated independent schools like Vancouver College, and then some of the public schools that are in the more affluent areas. And, that's going to be Lord Byng, Kitts High School, Prince of Wales High School, Tupper, and also some of the ones that are in the suburbs, like Sequim in Delta, as an example. But, whether it's in North Van, West Van, Richmond, these are all suburbs that have excellent high schools and elementary schools as well. And again, because of our provincial funding system. So I just want to cover a few tips. If you are thinking of moving here and you have children that are going to be attending school, what should you be thinking about and prioritizing when you're looking for a place to live, whether you're renting or buying? I think it's really important to note that if you are attending a public school, even if you are living in that catchment, that's not a guarantee that your child will be able to attend that school. It really depends on how subscribed they are. And if you're bringing that child years after, like not the entrance kindergarten level, but say it's grade 7 or grade 10 for a high school, it can be challenging to find a place in that school. So you may want to be reaching out to sort of your ideal schools to make sure that there's space for your child, or the possibility of a space for your child in those schools. Now, if you are thinking of a private school or one of the independent schools, keep in mind that there's not really a catchment for those schools, and that the students that are attending those schools are coming from a much broader geographic area. So, as an example, St. John's School, which is in Kitsilano, you might have kids coming from Point Grey, from Marpole, from downtown, and from Commercial Drive. And so there's not, the benefit of moving close to that school would be that the commute for you and or your child would be shorter getting them to school, but you're not really getting the benefit of being in the community with their friends and with the parents of the kids that go to the same school. For me, that's actually one of the big advantages of sending my kids to public school. I love the fact that our elementary school is a 10-minute walk away. I can walk my kids there. I see all the neighborhood families, we chat along the way, and then all the kids go to the same parks after school. They hang out there. They all know one another. So there's it tightens that sense of community, which I think would be a bit harder to find if you're sending your kid to a private school. And it's just important to know that, you don't need to prioritize moving into the quote-unquote catchment of a private school. As much as I've said that the catchment maybe isn't important, whether it's a private school or it doesn't guarantee you entering into the public school, there is something to be said with looking to move when you're purchasing into the catchment of what's considered stereotypically as being a good school, whether that's in the more affluent areas or not. But if a school has a reputation of being a strong school, it will attract more people. More people want to live, whether it's renting or buying. And that will help you sell that property down the road. So it's more likely that it will appreciate faster. It's not a guarantee, but what is pretty much a guarantee is that it's going to sell faster, because there's always people who want to move into that neighborhood. I'm not going to name a school, but whatever the school happens to be, that is sort of an enormous selling feature, being in a good school catchment. So definitely something to keep in mind if you're thinking of the purchase of your home as an investment. I really appreciate you watching that video all the way to the end. Thanks for sticking with me. I hope you got some value out of it. And if you did, I'd love a thumbs up. It'll help me push this video out to more people like you. Hit the subscribe button if you want to be seeing more of me. I do make videos just like this one every single week, all about moving to Vancouver and living in Vancouver. And I am a real estate agent that sells a lot of property in Vancouver, and I've focused my business on helping people that are coming here from elsewhere. So if you're thinking of moving here from somewhere else, I'd love to get that conversation started and show you how I can help you too. Reach out anytime. My contact information is right there on the screen. In the meantime, I am going to be putting out a video every single week just for you. There's some previous videos I think you're going to be interested in too. There's this one over here that we think you're really going to like. And then this was last week's video, so check that one out. I'll see you next week.